Weeping willows, thatched cottages, ancient churches, a mighty castle, and of course William Shakespeare combined to make this the most English of England's rivers. But there's another side to the Avon. Some of the most vicious battles in our country's history have taken place along its banks. We'd like you to join us on a unique journey of discovery along this fascinating waterway. The Avon rises in the Northamptonshire village of Naseby, although finding its source requires a little local knowledge. In the undergrowth beyond the wall of Manor Farm, this interesting little monument stands above a spring that marks the birth of the River Avon and the start of our journey. The stream that flows from it, though, remains tantalisingly obscure. From here, it's culverted under the road and runs beneath the cellars of the Fitzgerald Arms. Naseby, of course, is famous for staging one of the most decisive battles of the English Civil War. On the 13th of June 1645, 10,000 Royalist and 14,000 Parliamentarian troops clashed in this valley on the edge of the village. The result was a crushing defeat for the Royalists and marked the beginning of the end for King Charles I. No doubt the local pub did a roaring trade that night, and maybe local Avon water helped to wash away many a Roundhead hangover the following morning. Just beyond Naseby, the infant Avon that has been so reluctant to reveal itself comes to life in picturesque fashion. A haven for wildlife today, this reservoir is entirely man-made. It was created in the 18th century to feed the nearby Grand Union Canal, once one of the vital arteries of the Industrial Revolution. After a period of decline brought on by the age of the railways, the canals are coming to life again, as the activity at the marina at Welford demonstrates. Water not required by the Grand Union continues on a more natural course. A mile or so beyond Welford, the Avon changes direction and heads southeast, but that hasn't always been the case. If we'd have been making this journey, say, 500,000 years ago, we'd have followed a small river that drained northwards into the Trent. Then came the onset of the last major glaciation of Earth. Ice caps advanced into the Midlands from the north, blocking the flow of the Avon, which formed a huge glacial lake that covered the whole of Warwickshire, with the Cotswold Escarpment forming its southern shore. At its maximum, Lake Harrison, as it's known, was more than 200 feet deep. As the climate began to warm, about 15,000 years ago, the ice caps began to retreat from the south. The waters of Lake Harrison were able to cut through the former watershed and escape to the southeast. A mighty torrent carved out a new course for the Avon, laying down levels of silt and gravel into broad terraces of well-drained, fertile land, typical of the Avon Valley today. It's not long before the sparkling waters of the Avon are impounded for the second time in its short life, this time to fill Stanford Reservoir, which supplies the wider area with drinking water. Again, what's left continues its journey and leads us to the first village carrying the river's name. Our river soon undergoes a change of character. The agricultural landscape we've become used to suddenly is no more. We've arrived at Rugby, the first town on our journey. Anglo-Saxon in origin, the name Rugby means rough hill town, and the early settlement grew up on a rough hill overlooking the Avon. After it was granted a market charter in 1255, it began to expand slowly. Then in 1567, the establishment that sent the name Rugby echoing round the world was founded. Rugby School was the creation of Lawrence Sheriff, a native of the town, who became a wealthy London grocer. In his will, he left his house and £50 to build a school next door for the boys of Rugby and Brownsover, and by the end of the 17th century, it was attracting boys from all over the country. In 1823, Rugby's worldwide reputation received a further boost when a pupil at the school, William Webb Ellis, during a game of football, picked up the ball and began to run with it. Soon, his illegal style caught on, and the new game of rugby football was born. By the time we reach Newbold, just downstream, the Avon seems to be recovering from its encounter with Rugby. It's starting to resemble the Avon we know and love, its low, accessible riverside meadows providing a playground for the people that live along its banks. Soon we're back in more familiar-looking surroundings, as the Avon meanders happily through its lush valley. For the first time, the river enjoys an extended spell unhindered by man's efforts to capture it, although apparently it hasn't always been that way. The remains of an old mill, once powered by the Avon, provide evidence of man's interference. On the high ground overlooking the river here is another sign that this part of the Avon Valley was once more active than today. This ivy-clad tower is all that remains of the Church of St. Lawrence, built by the monks of Kenilworth Abbey. It served a small but thriving community based around Newnham Hall that stood nearby. The hall was demolished in the 1790s, and the rest of the church followed shortly after as the community dwindled. A few more delightful meanders lead us to Bretford. Bretford means broad ford, and the stone bridge here spans a natural crossing point of the Avon that formed a vital link in the ancient Fosse Way. This was one of the main roads in Roman Britain, linking Exeter and Lincoln. Rejuvenated by its spell in the country, the Avon is the liveliest we've seen it yet, and seems to be enjoying life as it skirts Coventry and passes through Ryton-on-Dunsmore. In 1043, Ryton-super-Dunsmore was given by Lady Godiva's husband, Earl Leofric, to the priory they jointly founded in Coventry. The old heathland of Dunsmore Heath was a desolate wilderness on which people had been known to lose their way, never to be seen again. In later centuries, the ground each side of the river was quarried for the sand and gravel laid down at the end of the last ice age. More recently still, the old gravel pits have been turned into Brandon Marsh Nature Reserve, designated a site of special scientific interest because of its standing as one of the most important wildfowl sites in the Midlands. Overlooking the valley beyond Ryton Bridge is another relic of the Roman occupation of Britain. The Luntz Fort near Baginton is an impressive reconstruction of a Roman stronghold built in about 60 AD, shortly after the revolt by the Iceni tribe, led by the legendary Boadicea. A unique feature of the Lunt is the Gyrus, a circular enclosure where the Romans trained their horses for battle. our river now heads for the village of Stoneleigh, a delightful place, unless, that is, you fancy a pint. In the 19th century, Stoneleigh was a popular destination for cyclists from Coventry. One Sunday in 1890, a group of them outside the Stoneleigh Arms whistled at Cordelia, the daughter of the lord of the manor, Sir William Lee. He was so incensed, he ordered that the pub be closed for good, and that there should never be another in the village. Just beyond Stoneleigh, the Avon is considerably swelled by the River Sow, its first major tributary, that flows along the eastern edge of Coventry. The enlarged Avon almost encircles the grounds of Stoneleigh Abbey, a 12th century religious establishment that passed to the Lee family in 1561 and was their home until the late 20th century. Today it's an imposing events, conference and banqueting centre. 600 acres adjoining the estate are leased by the Royal Agricultural Centre, and every July host the Royal Show. Another extravagant meander leads us to Ashow, with its ancient church and almost as ancient yew tree. Yew trees are common in English churchyards because they once provided the material for making the traditional longbow. In Ashow is another symbol of the favoured weapon of warfare in the Middle Ages. In 1363, Edward III ordered the practice of archery every Sunday after the church service. In many villages, the churchyard itself was the practice ground. On the east wall of Ashow Church are marks made by bowmen sharpening their arrows. It's an intriguing thought that the men who made them may have played their part in the English victory at Agincourt in 1415. The Avon now leads us to another of the many watermills that once occupied the riverbank. This one better preserved than most, and enjoying a new lease of life. The next stretch of the river is unique for the Avon in that its west bank is dominated by steep cliffs that tower 50 feet above the water. Teetering rather precariously on the cliff edge is the ruined Guy's Cliff House, built as a private residence in 1751, but long since abandoned. The Guy who gave his name to the cliff is the legendary local Saxon hero, Guy of Warwick. He'd left his wife Phyllis at home to undertake a pilgrimage and returned at the time of the Viking invasion. Guy slew the Danish champion Colbrand in single-handed combat at Winchester, then came back to a cave overlooking the Avon here to live out his days as a hermit. As he lay dying 25 years later, he sent his ring to Phyllis as a token of love. She recognised it immediately and set out to find her beloved Guy. As she held him in her arms, Guy died, and the distraught Phyllis threw herself off the cliff into the Avon. The waters that supposedly claimed her life now flow gently on into Warwick. On the outskirts of Warwick, the Avon passes under Portobello Bridge that carries traffic on the busy Emscote Road over the river. Just past the bridge we come to the confluence with the River Leam, which is almost as big as the Avon itself and swells our river dramatically. Another sweep brings us into Warwick itself. The fortified borough of Warwick was founded on the banks of the River Avon in 914 AD by Ethelfleda, granddaughter of Alfred the Great, as a defence against the Danish invaders, on a site overlooking earlier riverside settlements. Her fort controlled both the river valley and a natural ford on the Avon, on the roads to London and Coventry and the Saltway to Droitwich. Under the Normans, Warwick's strategic importance continued, with a large Motte and Bailey castle built in 1068 to guard the river crossing and subdue the local population. Warwick Castle was rebuilt in stone in the 13th century and added to through the ages, reaching its peak of importance in Tudor times, when the Earl of Warwick was one of the most powerful barons in the land. A large town grew in the shadow of the castle, but in 1694 a great fire swept through Warwick and destroyed most of its medieval and Elizabethan architecture. Fortunately, Mill Street on the edge of town survived intact, and there surely can't be a finer array of timber and cobble anywhere in England. But there's even more to Mill Street than first meets the eye. At the bottom is one of Warwick's least known attractions, but one that no visitor should miss. The modest entry charge to Mill Garden is worth every penny, particularly as it all goes to charity. The picturesque tranquility of this delightful place, though, belies the activity that once took place here. At the bottom of the garden is a most splendid water feature, the River Avon, and tucked away in a corner is an impressive piece of rockery, Warwick Castle. In fact, this was once one of the busiest places in town. The stone remnants in the water are the remains of Warwick's old bridge, built in the 14th century. For 400 years, this now overgrown edifice carried a constant stream of visitors to and from the most important town in the region. Visitors had to pay a toll to enter Warwick, and Mill Cottage was the collection point. Anyone caught trying to sneak across without paying was liable to end up in the stocks, which now form another unusual garden feature. The old bridge was only wide enough for one cart, and by the 18th century was hopelessly inadequate. Work started 300 yards upstream on a new one, leaving this a romantic ruin from a bygone age. In a rather better state of repair is the mill that, from the 15th century, drew on the power of the Avon to grind corn into flour to keep the castle entourage supplied with bread. In the late 19th century, the innovative Earl and Countess of Warwick had the mill machinery adapted to drive electricity generating equipment. The work was completed in December 1894, and the great switch-on of 475 light bulbs took place on Countess Daisy's birthday. The mill and engine house have recently been restored and can now generate enough hydroelectricity to keep Warwick Castle running. Leaving the grandeur of Warwick Castle and the magic of Mill Street reluctantly behind, the Avon takes us on a meandering path through the glorious heart of England countryside. Eventually we arrive at Charlecote Park, home of the Lucy family since the 12th century. The present house was started by Sir Thomas Lucy in 1551 and completed in the reign of Elizabeth I, who was once entertained at Charlecote. It's said that a young William Shakespeare suffered the wrath of Sir Thomas for poaching his deer, but gained revenge by later ridiculing him in one of his plays. Around another large loop in the Avon leads us to the great man's birthplace. The Town Council records for 1559 contain an entry that marks the early days of the Shakespeare family in Stratford. In the September elections, John Shakespeare, a new arrival from Snitterfield, was the only one of the 4 constables asked to continue in office. John had trained as a glove maker, married Mary Arden, and set up home in Henley Street, Stratford. It was here, on the 23rd of April 1564, that William was born. The Stratford he grew up in was a far cry from the tourist trap of today. As constable, his father was reminded to enforce the bylaw that young unmarried men should not come into the town with daggers and other offensive weapons. Even the town officials were not beyond reproach. Alderman Richard Simons was fined for letting his ducks and pigs wander about in the streets. Robert Perrot, the High Bailiff, was fined for making and selling unwholesome beer, and so many people were charged with allowing their dogs out without muzzles that the bylaw against this had to be reimposed. Against a backdrop of this apparent mayhem, John Shakespeare's standing in Stratford grew. He became High Bailiff in 1568, and, as well as his trade as glover, he was a wool dealer and moneylender. In 1582, 18-year-old William married 26-year-old Anne Hathaway, and by 1585 they had 3 children, but William, it seems, had itchy feet. In 1586 he left Stratford for London in search of fame and fortune. Quite what sparked this life-changing move isn't clear, but it's been suggested that, to avoid prosecution for poaching at Charlecote Park, he joined a London-based travelling theatre company. By 1592, under the patronage of the Earl of Southampton, a favourite of Queen Elizabeth, Shakespeare was established as a dramatist. His success in the London theatres made him wealthy, but he maintained close links with his hometown, and in 1597 he bought New Place, one of the largest houses in Stratford. From about 1611, he retired from the limelight to spend his time in Stratford, where he died in 1616 on his 52nd birthday. During William Shakespeare's lifetime, the fortunes of Stratford had changed dramatically. The prosperous market town of 2,000 people at his birth had been ravaged by plague, a series of disastrous fires, and the collapse of the wool market. Stratford's misfortune continued in the 17th century and was aggravated by the English Civil War, when the town was occupied by parliamentarian troops. There was yet more misery in 1645, when plague again ravaged the town. The end of the Civil War the following year marked the start of a slight improvement in Stratford's fortunes, but it was another century before the path to its future prosperity was determined. With the rise of Puritanism, which reached a peak during the rule of Oliver Cromwell, the theatre had dwindled from its Elizabethan heyday to almost nothing, and William Shakespeare's work was all but forgotten. After the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, in the shape of the fun-loving Charles II, entertainment was back on the menu, but his tastes were more slapstick. It was David Garrick, born in Hereford in 1717, who almost single-handedly transformed the theatre. As manager of Drury Lane Theatre in London, he established a standard of excellence in production and acting previously unsurpassed, and made the profession socially acceptable. More importantly for us, Garrick was a Shakespeare fan and resurrected many of his plays. To pay homage to the Bard of Avon and consolidate the revival of Shakespearean drama, David Garrick organised a 3-day celebration of Shakespeare that took place in Stratford in September 1769. The event attracted many eminent people from London and drew the attention of high society to the delights of the quiet little town on the Avon. The timing was perfect. Huge improvements in the state of the country's roads in the late 18th century made travel a more comfortable and less time-consuming business. This heralded both the heyday of the stagecoaching era and the beginnings of Stratford as a tourist attraction. Many of Stratford's inns were enlarged to provide stabling for horses and more accommodation for the increased numbers of visitors to the town, all with money to spend. The stagecoaches are long gone, but trains, then cars and aeroplanes keep the visitors coming. And since those early days, tourism in Stratford has grown into a multi-million-pound industry. Some locals, though, fed up with the constant flow of half-empty tour buses, or strangers from all over the world peering through their windows, might happily wring David Garrick's neck. The early 19th century brought another major boost to Stratford's economy. The Stratford Canal opened in 1816, linking the Avon with 2,000 miles of waterways. Soon laden barges jostled for space in Bancroft Basin, waiting to pass through the lock onto the river. The use of the Avon has changed considerably since its days as a busy trade route, but the stretch of river through Stratford is as lively as ever. The riverbank here is dominated by the imposing parish church of Holy Trinity, the final resting place of William Shakespeare. This lock marks the limit for the flotilla of small boats that litter the Avon at Stratford. So it's all aboard the flagship Swallow to continue our journey. Unfortunately, as we head out of Stratford, the heavens open. Still, we shouldn't complain too much. After all, it's the English weather that makes the Avon Valley so green and pleasant. The river we know today, though, is a far cry from its natural state. Until the early 17th century, the Avon varied between a muddy brook in summer to a raging torrent in winter, for much of the year impassable and totally unreliable for trade. In 1636, King Charles I granted William Sandys of Fladbury permission to make the river navigable from Tewkesbury up to Stratford. He used his private fortune to buy up the necessary land and create a series of sluices, weirs, artificial channels and locks that maintained river levels for transport. After the railways brought about the decline of the use of inland waterways for trade in the 19th century, the whole system fell into disrepair. More recently, they've undergone restoration, opening up the delights of the Avon to the cruise of leisure craft. The river from Stratford down to Evesham is now maintained by the Upper Navigation Trust. At Welford, the river becomes wider and shallower. Since man first inhabited the Avon Valley, this was an important natural fording point for hunter-gatherers tracking the herds of wild animals that once roamed the country. After a few miles, the riverside parish church of Bidford-on-Avon looms into view. Just around the bend is another age-old river crossing. Bidford's medieval packhorse bridge stands on the site of a ford that once formed part of the important north-south Roman road known as Ricknield Street. The town of Bidford is built entirely on the higher north bank of the river. The low south bank is prone to flooding and used for a picnic, sports and leisure area. Beyond Bidford, we enter a delightful 6-mile-long stretch of river, unbroken by towns or villages, and only fully appreciated by boat, even in the driving rain. We are under cover after all, but not when there's work to do. Ah, the joys of boating. There are signs, though, that our fortunes may be about to change. The appearance of a rainbow confirms it. The sun is breaking through, cause for some jubilation on board. Other more subtle changes are also taking place. Some while ago, we passed from Warwickshire into Worcestershire, and we're now entering the fertile Vale of Evesham. Our spell in the wilderness comes to an end as we approach the weir and loch near Offanem. This bit of river has something of a gruesome past. After the Battle of Evesham in 1264, many of Simon de Montfort's defeated army fled the battlefield. They were intercepted as they tried to cross the Avon near Offanem and slaughtered. Their bodies were thrown into the river, and this stretch became known as Dead Man's Height. Around another gentle bend, we come to Evesham. On the opposite bank at Bengeworth is the first of many caravan parks to spring up on the banks of the Avon. It was established in the 1950s by local plumber and decorator Dennis Knott, who realised the potential for holiday homes for the increased numbers of people owning cars. At Evesham Loch we pass from the upper to the lower Avon navigation, and there's a resident lockkeeper on hand to help. Like the upper Avon, the river below Evesham fell victim to the railways, and by 1949 was almost unnavigable. In that year, Charles Barwell bought the lower Avon navigation for £1,500. He managed to keep it open until the Lower Avon Navigation Trust was formed on August 1st, 1950, with Mr. Barwell as chairman. The following year, work started on restoring the waterway. The whole navigation from Evesham to Tewkesbury was formally reopened on the 10th of June 1962. This was the first successful venture of its kind in the world, and started the renaissance of the inland waterways that are now so popular. So the gates to Evesham are opened for us. Unfortunately, it's raining again, so our crew decide to call it a day and head for the pub. After a pint or three, our cameraman is quite taken with Evesham Bridge and its shimmering reflection, and I must admit, I can see why. The following morning, no rain, and a chance for a quick look round Old Asam. The town's trio of spires serve to remind us that this was a place of some considerable religious importance. The high ground on which the town stands was once part of the Royal Forest of Feckenham, contained within a loop of the Avon. It was known as Hom, which was derived from Holm, meaning island. In about 700 AD, Egwin, the Bishop of Worcester, founded a monastery on the hillside overlooking the Avon, and a town began to grow around it. Evesham's distinctive three spires are made up of the medieval Church of All Saints, built by the abbot for the use of the townsfolk, and St. Lawrence, built for the use of the large number of pilgrims visiting the tomb of St. Egwin. The third is the bell tower, built in 1538 to house the abbey bells and provide a grand entrance to the monks' graveyard. This was the last building project undertaken by the abbey, because 2 years later Henry VIII's commissioners arrived in town to close it down as part of his radical reformation of the English Church. After the dissolution, the site became a source of building stone, and a number of Evesham's buildings, including the town hall, were made from the abbey. The bell tower survived because the townspeople scraped together £100 to buy it. The abbey had been Evesham's main employer, and its closure left a huge hole in the town's economy, a hole that wasn't completely filled until the Avon was made navigable a century later. Busy quays carried away the produce of the fertile vale and brought in bulk supplies of fuel, until now scarce in the region. By the early 19th century, locally grown fruit and vegetables were taking up more and more space in the warehouses and barges at Evesham's bustling wharves. By now, the narrow 12th century Evesham Bridge was inadequate to handle the traffic using it. Things came to a head when a woman was crushed to death by a passing wagon. Local solicitor Henry Workman of Hampton formed a committee to raise funds for a replacement. The original plans were for a steel suspension bridge, but the cost was way above the £9,200 in the kitty. The committee decided on the present design at a cost of £13,000, with the difference raised by public subscription. Henry Workman was elected mayor every year for the 5 years it took to build the bridge, which was named after him. In the course of its erection, dredgings from the river were used to raise the level of the riverbank on the Evesham side that had previously been prone to flooding. This made it possible to lay out the pleasure grounds, also named after Mr. Workman. Among the numerous attractions were the paddling pools, created from the former Abbey fish ponds. It's now time for us to continue our exploration of the River Avon. Evesham Rowing Club was formed in June 1863 to stage a regatta to run at the same time as the Agricultural and Horticultural Show in September. The regatta became an annual event and led to Evesham being known as the Henley of the Midlands. Adding to the spectacle were the pleasure steamers of Charles Bird, a common sight in Evesham in the early 20th century. Originally, they operated from near the Fleece Inn that stood at the bottom of Bridge Street, but later moved to the River Gardens, further downstream on the opposite bank. Here 500 people could take luncheons and teas in comfort while they waited for their boat. We leave Evesham town centre beneath Abbey Bridge, built in 1928 to carry the busy A435 over the river. Beyond the bridge is the inevitable caravan park. Alongside it, the River Isbourne joins the Avon. As we continue our loop around Evesham, we come to another age-old river crossing. Exactly when the rope ferry between Evesham and Hampton started isn't known, but it could be almost as old as Hampton itself, an Anglo-Saxon settlement. We do know that it was used by the monks of Evesham to get to their vineyards, laid out on the terraces of Clark's Hill across the river from the Abbey. The vineyards have since been replaced by caravans. Just past the now demolished Midland Railway Bridge is Glover's Island, named after Frank Glover, once a well-known local fighting man. Illegal bare-knuckle bouts were held on the island, which lay in no man's land between Worcestershire and Gloucestershire, and beyond the jurisdiction of both constabularies. We've now completed our journey around Evesham, but just before we leave it behind, on the hill overlooking the Avon is a final reminder of its past. Abbey Manor House stands near the site of the Battle of Evesham. Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, met his death here at the hands of Henry III's son, Edward. De Montfort's earlier military successes had left him master of England after leading a barons' revolt that led to the formation of an English government free of royal control. All that ended, though, when Prince Edward outmanoeuvred de Montfort and cornered his army at Evesham. The two factions clashed on Greenhill. De Montfort was routed, and another chapter of English history closed, as the grandfather of Parliament was hacked to pieces. We soon arrive at Chadbury Lock, the first major project undertaken by the Lower Avon Navigation Trust. The actual restoration work was done by the Royal Engineers, making it the first civilian project carried out by the armed forces. Chadbury Lock is also the gateway to the next leg of our journey. The steeper valley sides produce a change in the nature of the Avon, confining it to a narrower channel. The opposing riverbanks here show quite different characteristics. The manicured right bank is home to Evesham Golf Club, while the left bank is a little more natural. Before long the hills recede, allowing our river to spread out a little. We're now approaching Fladbury, a significant place in the history of the Avon. This was once home to William Sandys, who first made it navigable in the 17th century. Standing between the lock and weir is a private residence in an enviable location, if you like water that is. This is the former Cropthorne Mill. Beyond Jubilee Bridge, carrying the local road from Cropthorne to Fladbury, we enter a lovely stretch of river. Low-lying water meadows on both sides mean that roads and villages are built a safe distance away, which gives us the chance to really appreciate the river. The tantalising glimpse of a kingfisher skimming the surface is all too fleeting. Swans are considerably less secretive. The mute swan is our largest wild bird and the only breed of swan native to these shores. There are about 30,000 of them in Britain today, a 40% increase on the 1980s, since anglers were banned from using lead weights. The mute swan has enjoyed protected status for centuries, although not originally for their own benefit. In the Middle Ages, they were frequently served up for dinner, and a medieval banquet could include as many as 50 swans on the menu. They were such a valuable commodity, they were marked as belonging to a particular monastery or nobleman. The marks were registered with the Crown under the supervision of the Royal Swan Master. Any unmarked birds were considered royal property. The penalty for killing a royal swan was severe, and probably saved the species from being hunted to extinction. The turkey, introduced from North America in the 16th century, gradually replaced swan on the menu, so that today we simply enjoy their graceful company. The mute swan's main diet is aquatic plants, but our next visitor is a highly efficient predator. The aristocratic grey heron can stalk its prey with deadly stealth, or stand motionless for hours on end until fish, small birds or mammals come within striking distance of his deadly sword-like beak. The heron hunts alone, giving the impression that they are solitary creatures. In fact, they roost in colonies, venturing out alone only to hunt or to gather material for the nest. As well as providing dinner for the heron and his family, the Avon helps to nurture the juicy products of the Vale. The riverside fruit farms draw on the Avon to water their crop. In the distance is the imposing site of Pershore Abbey, our next port of call. For us though, that's some way off, as the Avon takes us on a wide sweep around Bredon Hill, a dominating feature of the landscape for some time to come. The river here divides briefly to form a small island, with a resident Robinson Crusoe by the looks of it. This is known as Osier Island. Osier are the shoots created by cutting back willow and used for making baskets. Osier beds were once common along the river valleys where willow flourishes. Eventually we come back to civilization in the shape of Wyre Piddle, where the gardens sweep right down to the river. Just past Wyre Lock are the offices and social club of the Lower Avon Navigation Trust, based in a converted grist mill. The Avon completes its loop and now leads us to Pershore. This has been a religious centre since the late 7th century, when King Ethelred of Mercia gave land to establish a monastery here. In late Saxon times, Persia became the focal point of a religious cult surrounding St Edburga, a granddaughter of Alfred the Great. After her death, some bits of her were brought here, and pilgrims from all over England came to pray in front of them. Pershore Abbey fared better than Evesham in Henry VIII's dissolution. The townsfolk managed to raise £400 to buy the former monks' choir and put it to use as their parish church. Most of Pershore's architecture is far more recent. The town's Georgian High Street reflects its 18th century heyday as an important staging post on the main London to Holyhead stagecoach route. Stagecoaches thundering through here are a thing of the past, and Pershore residents today have to contend with the pressure of modern traffic. Our mode of travel is a little more leisurely. Beyond Pershore Lock, we come to an old bridge with a remarkable past. Its story starts in the 11th century, after part of the estates of Pershore Abbey were seized by Edward the Confessor and granted to his newly founded Westminster Abbey. Pershore parish was now split. St Andrew's Church was built to serve the tenants of the Abbot of Westminster, and a wooden bridge built across the Avon to link Westminster estates on opposite banks of the river. Early in the 15th century, the wooden bridge was replaced with the present one, after the Abbot of Pershore drowned trying to cross it. The English Civil War saw further alterations. In 1644, King Charles was fleeing Oxford and heading for his power base at Worcester, with a parliamentary army on his tail. He crossed Pershore Bridge, then ordered its destruction to delay the pursuing Roundhead army. Unfortunately, in their haste to carry out the command, 40 soldiers drowned in the Avon. Subsequent repairs left the centre arch a different shape to the others, a lasting reminder of the tragedy. By 1926, the Packhorse Bridge was struggling to cope in the age of the motor car, and a new crossing was built just downstream. But that wasn't the end of the story for the old bridge. In 1940, when a German invasion seemed imminent, Britain began to prepare for a guerrilla war on its own soil. Preparations were made to defend strategic points and hold up the advance of the enemy. Anti-aircraft obstacles were laid out in Weir Meadow, gun emplacements and pillboxes erected, and anti-tank barriers placed across the bridges. The threat of invasion passed, but some of the defences are still in place, a stark reminder of how seriously it was taken. Our river now takes a wildly meandering route across a broad valley containing both the Severn and the Avon. The far side of the valley is marked by the Malvern Hills. We're still in the dominant presence of Bredon Hill. Analysis of the name Bredon Hill produces a curious result. Bree is the Celtic word for hill. Dun is the Anglo-Saxon word for hill. Hill, of course, is our word for hill. So here we are, on hill, 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 that commands extensive views over the surrounding countryside and historically controlled the passage by land and water through the lower Severn and Avon valleys. Celtic tribes who colonised the region in about the 6th century BC built a large fort here, and the earthen defences are still clearly visible. At the heart of the fort is a large rock known as the Banbury Stone. It's thought this may have been some kind of altar where pagan religious rites, including perhaps human sacrifice, were carried out under the careful supervision of the mystical druids. Tales of its magical properties persisted, and until fairly recently, locals believed that it was good luck to kiss the stone on Good Friday. Another stone structure on the hill is of more recent origin. William Parsons, Lord of the Manor of Overbury, built the lonely tower on top for no other reason than to raise the height of the hill from its natural 961 feet to exactly 1,000. In World War II, a more practical use was found for Parsons Folly, as it was known. It served as an observation point for the RAF bases at Deptford and Pershore. Back on the river, our attention turns to the delicate manoeuvrings required to negotiate 16th century Eckington Bridge. Its small, irregular arches have stood the test of time and also test the skills of inexperienced boaters. That successfully completed, just, the ever-present Breedon Hill looms large again. In days gone by, pre-Michael Fish and Company, Breedon Hill provided the local weather forecast, summed up by this little rhyme. When Breedon Hill does clear appear, ye men of the vale have naught to fear. When Breedon Hill does wear his cap, ye men of the vale, beware of that. All nonsense, of course. Or maybe not. Suddenly we're in the grip of a violent storm. Time to batten down the hatches. Fortunately, it ends as quickly as it starts. But as locals and regular users of the distant M5 will know, after periods of prolonged rainfall, these meadows are often submerged. As well as the constant roar of motorway traffic, the peace of the Avon Valley here is frequently broken by the sound of military planes passing overhead. 1,000 years ago, it was the sound from another machine of war that struck terror into the hearts of local residents. In 958 AD, longboats carrying fierce Viking warriors swept up the Severn and Avon. Their main targets were the wealthy riverside abbeys, including Evesham, Pershore and Breedon. They were pillaged and burnt, and anyone who stood in their way slaughtered. Breedon Abbey was later rebuilt in grand style. After the Reformation, the Abbey Church became the parish church, and its elegant spire still graces the Avon Valley. We now pass beneath the M5 and finally wave goodbye to Breedon Hill. No time for us to sample the hospitality of the Fleet Inn as we embark on the final stage of our journey. Still, the river holds its own attractions. As it enters Tewkesbury, the Avon splits into two. These sluices and weir mark the point at which the old natural course of the river, known as Old Avon, departs from the main navigable course. This channel, known as Millhaven, is entirely man-made and takes us through King John's Bridge towards Tewkesbury town centre. As the name suggests, the main purpose of the Millhaven was to power a series of water mills, and is thought to have originally been dug in Saxon times. This branch of the Avon leads us to Abbey Mill, that once served the needs of the community of the town's imposing centrepiece, Tewkesbury Abbey. This began life as a small Benedictine priory. After the Norman conquest, it was rebuilt in magnificent style. The Abbey Church of St Mary the Virgin survived the dissolution because the townsfolk bought it from Henry VIII for £483. The remaining buildings were demolished, but this remains one of the largest parish churches in England. The meadows around Tewkesbury Abbey have also played an important part in the town's history. This monument marks the site of Holme Castle, originally a Saxon manor house, and in the 12th century a residence of the Norman Earls of Gloucester. Our journey began at the scene of a mighty English battle, and as it reaches its end, we have another bloody tale to tell. On the 4th of May 1471, the Yorkist Edward IV defeated his Lancastrian rival, Edward, Prince of Wales, here in Tewkesbury, in the decisive battle of the Wars of the Roses. 2,000 men were slaughtered in these meadows. Beyond Bloody Meadow, as part of the battlefield became known, the Millhaven meets its own end as it's swallowed up by the River Severn. Our journey takes us into Avon Loch, that will lower us down to the Old Avon and also out to meet the Severn. It was the meeting of the Severn and Avon that determined Tewkesbury's early fortunes. Until the 17th century, trade on the Severn alone supported the town, with large quantities of goods, particularly Cotswold wool, loaded for ports in the far southwest. After the Avon was made navigable and the Midlands were opened up to river trade, Tewkesbury became an important transshipment port, where goods were loaded from the smaller Avon boats onto the large Severn trows. The town prospered as a busy market centre and inland port, and Tewkesbury's architecture bears witness to its wealth in Elizabethan and Georgian times. The railway that superseded water transport bypassed Tewkesbury, and the old town we see today is little changed from its heyday. Sadly, our remarkable journey comes to an end, as just around its final meander, this most English of England's rivers is engulfed by a Celtic giant. The River Severn has forged its own momentous course from the Welsh mountains, and now whisks the waters of the Avon on to adventures new.